if we were going on a road trip and we couldn't stop by any gas stations, what would we do to make sure we have enough gas? We'd load up gas canisters in the back of our car so we could always pour it in. We're bringing more than we need because we know we can't stop along the way. So that's for people who, gosh, I'm not going to be able to, maybe I'm a nurse and I can't eat for these 5 hours because we're really busy. I'm going to eat a little bit more than I need energy-wise to get me through those 5 hours.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Biometal Fitness. Today I'm sitting down with Davin Lau, a registered dietitian and a good friend. So the interviews with the pros videos that we made last week resonated with a few of you so well that Dav and I are going to be continuing our discussion on food and societal implications about the way we talk about food and the way that we view it. So today we're going to start off with a brief discussion of current events, and then we're going to jump right into a food discussion soon afterwards. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in just a few seconds.
Alrighty, man. How's your week going?
Lots of crazy stuff going on in the world, to say the least.
Yeah, it's definitely been wild. I was actually just watching some stuff right now. People walking up to get medical care for somebody who was shot with a rubber bullet, and then as they're carrying this kid up, this like 20-year-old kid who was shot. As they're carrying this kid up past the cops start shooting the people who are carrying the kid. And it's not the first case that's happened where they were like, yeah, come on by, and then they pepper spray him.
Right.
Yeah, it's brutal. What's your opinion on everything, man?
I think a lot of people are at crossroads, but at least for me, being a person of color minority, I think it's interesting to think that people are upset now, but this has been something that's been going on, and it's just not in the media as it is currently now. So I don't know, I'm not more or less upset, but I just think it's interesting who's finally coming to actualization of like, wow, this is some people's reality, and like, just trying to educate myself more on it. But how about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I'd say like I've dealt with minority injustice a little bit. Obviously I'm mostly white, but like, growing up, I would, being Asian, it's just, we experience a different type of prejudice. But for me, it wasn't like, it wasn't ever something I really thought too much about. And like, as of the past few years, I've started to really understand like what the difference is between like opportunity and, what's the word I'm looking for? Starts with a P. Opportunity and it starts with a P. I'm forgetting. It's not prejudice.
Oh, like privilege?
Privilege, yeah. I don't know why I was spacing. So like between opportunity and privilege, like the difference and the connection between all that. And you said you're not like more or less upset. I think I'm actually more upset now, partly because of the fact that I'm more upset at myself because I didn't realize that so much of this was really going on, constantly. It's not just stuff that like pops up. Like, the George Floyd was kind of the spark for all of this.
Sure.
But, 4 years ago we were rioting for the exact same reason, and then what happened after that? Nothing. They started wearing body cams, and then nothing still really happened. But I think one thing that I'm more mad about is the way that the riots are being handled by the cops. They're just, it's like they're using tear gas, and tear gas is not like the United Nations has said that is chemical warfare, and you're not allowed to use tear gas, chemical warfare in
right.
war. We're using it on our own citizens. So it's infuriating me that like this is obviously an issue and it's being handled in the way that it is. So.
Right. I definitely hope that this isn't a trend or something, and trend in a sense that it goes away, right? I think there's, where will everybody be 2 weeks from now, 2 months from now, years from now? Because it's still gonna, the system is what it is, and it's gonna take a long time to deconstruct it as it was constructed. So
yeah, that's wild, man. Well, I'll definitely keep checking in on that one, but guess we might as well hop into kind of some of the other conversation we were hoping to talk about a little bit.
Yeah,
So, is there anything that you wanted to like start off with before we really got into the weeds?
No, not really. I mean, I've been out of work lately, so I haven't had these conversations as readily. Um, so I'm open to just kind of discussing it, and I might not have like prominent examples on hand, but I'll do my best to elaborate on it. And I'd love to hear more about with what we talked about previously within the last maybe like 6 to 8 months we've talked. Just like what you've seen, what you've kind of thought about in your future career, or what you do with your clients currently.
Yeah. I guess maybe to that point, since we really started conversing, like my eyes have opened to the type of, I guess, another type of prejudice, the type of prejudice against being in a large body. Both ones that I have like just within myself. I would like to think that I really am not the type of person to judge one way or the other. Maybe I used to, but you know, the more that I got comfortable coaching and the more that I got comfortable talking to other people and working with the types of things they have going on in their lives and then bringing that into the gym or walking out of the gym with it, it really like opened my eyes a little bit more. And then talking with you was just a refreshing perspective to see that like there's actual healthcare initiatives going forward with the fact that it doesn't necessarily have to look a certain way. And yeah, that was just so big for me. Because for the longest time, I mean, we've chatted about this before. For the longest time, like most people get started into fitness for aesthetic reasons. It's usually, you know, it's usually like, how do I get looking better? How do I get, you know, it's so from that perspective, like I look back and like, yeah, that's where I started too. You know, I wanted to look really good. I wanted to have the six pack that I never really had, and
Right.
you know, and all that. And so, but anyways, I would say that probably the biggest thing that I started to notice after you had mentioned it, like when you approach food, the morality of food. I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the morality of food, or the way that we talk about food in a moral perspective.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you kind of dissect it. The language we use is very impactful, right? It has a lot of gives a lot of context to not only what I might impart on you, but how I feel about my relationship with food. And I get as a dietitian, I get a lot of insight by asking individuals, you know, what are their emotions around certain foods? Because then we start to categorize things as potentially good or bad. And why using that terminology is harmful and actually divisive and potentially discriminatory. And how do we, health professionals, specifically someone like myself, who knows lots of nutrition science and facts, how would I categorize a food as superior than another? And I have to really look at a bigger scope than just who has access to those foods, because that's not always the reality, right? And as a dietitian, I like to be able to give information that applies to everybody, not just, you know, the 1% or the people who have access to health and food. So the problem, I think, when we start to categorize, okay, what's a good and what's a bad food? A very classic example I'll use is like, okay, like an apple or a hamburger, right? Like which one's good and which one's healthier? And 9 times out of 10 people will say, or even 10 times out of 10, but like the burger is worse than the apple, and the apple's the healthy choice. Kind of breaking down why someone might think that, okay, the burger is processed per se. The apple has less calories. These are all potentially maybe scientifically supported reasonings for why this food might be healthier. And I'd argue that's incorrect. There are nutrients in a burger. They're just different. They might be more, they might be less. But nevertheless, food has nutrients. And I don't think we should ever ignore that idea that something doesn't have value, because it holds energy. And like we always talk about, the most important thing in nutrition is getting enough to eat. And a lot of people don't have that reality. The unfortunate when we put good and bad, people start to label and associate themselves with those foods, right? I eat good foods, therefore I feel good. regardless of the actual nutrients that are in it, I'd argue. Some people might say, oh, I eat like fast food and I feel bad. I might follow up with a question and say like, well, you've abstained from carbohydrates for a very long time, and now you've eaten, quite a bit more than you're used to, and your body is not familiar with that nearly as much as a consistent intake. So maybe that's why it's not the food. It's just, here's a larger amount you've taken in of food, and the actual bad food, that has no implication on your ability to take care of your health. And I think we put people in that category, like, you are responsible for your health from the food you eat to the exercise you do and etc. But failing to recognize, like, what are the barriers or why someone might not want to take care of their health as we see it.
Right. Or might not be able to in the way that the access to healthcare is huge there too. One thing I wanted to kind of quickly comment on, or maybe ask you further about, like, when you look at the perspective of like, oh, this food makes me feel bad. I mean, there are foods, especially as an athlete. I mean, you know that when you get it into, like, classically, if you are on a stricter plan that you're eating what you need, you know, you're getting all of the nutrients that you need, and like the mental barriers aside, or the mental side effects aside from being super strict on your nutrition, when you get into the point of eating clean, when you get to the point of eating like more raw foods, like when you tend towards more whole foods, and then, you know, they tend to be like just like more higher quality fats. You have proteins that are a little bit more easily digestible, things like that. When you start to get used to eating things like that, and you feel your body running, and you feel you start to kind of settle, your body settles into this groove, and your performance begins to increase, and and some of the other trackers like lean muscle mass increases, body fat decreases, those things that people associate with health. But as an athlete, you start to feel that, like, oh, I'm like, my body's working and I'm doing well. And then you do go and eat a fast food burger, even if you're eating it within the bounds of what, you know, another meal would look like. Let's say I'm tracking macros and I eat a burger at home that I make. And then I go out and I eat a McDonald's burger, and they're macros wise, they're pretty similar, but the McDonald's burger would make me feel worse. How do you approach people who are kind of working with that kind of thing, who have been eating clean for so long that now their body sort of almost like rejects and starts to feel sickly whenever they do eat something that they suspect to be unhealthy for them?
Yeah, so there's two parts to that kind of answer that I would give. The first one is being when you start to figure out what foods work for your body, that's based on your own intuition, right? Your own knowledge and experience of how this food makes me feel. Do I enjoy this food? And things of that nature, right? Sort of self-reflecting. We call that interoceptive awareness. So being able to check in with your body and say, what foods sound good to me? You know, what's going to help me potentially perform, or what's going to give me greatest satisfaction? What's going to satisfy my hunger and satiety? Those are the keys you use to decide what foods make you feel good. Sometimes they're more nutrient dense, right? In some cases, people really gravitate towards nutrient dense food, but other times, in a cultural sense, you may have grown up on foods that aren't as nutrient dense, but your body functions well with them and they make you feel good. And there's a balance between the two. It's when someone becomes so rigid about a certain eating style, certain types of foods, certain food preparations, that it gives them an overwhelming amount of anxiety, right? So it's a behavior, it's an eating behavior that's disordered, right? We don't have flexibility within our nutrition patterns. An example of that, that comes to mind, is if someone only eats food that they prepare, and say me and that person go travel, do a road trip, right? And the only thing we can eat is like fast food on the road because we got to get to where we're going. But they're so rigid, they'd rather starve themselves and not consume food and energy for the sake of that rigidity okay, that's a disordered behavior that could
Okay.
potentially lead into an eating disorder. Um, so, like you're saying, it's totally fine to have preferences, but why do you have that preference, right? Did society say this is a superfood that's supposed to make you feel good?
Hmm.
Because the placebo effect is massive,
Yeah.
in this country, and even within food, we call it the nocebo effect, which is restricting certain foods, like taking food groups out. That has a placebo effect as well. So you really have to try and, or at least I try to dissect where these intentions are coming from, and is it your own personal knowledge, or is it someone influencing you who has no credibility or has no information on who you are and what you like to eat.
Right. It's something anecdotal that kind of comments on that. Like rice, white rice is my absolute. I love white rice so much. I grew up eating it. I had it with almost every single meal for dinner growing up.
Yeah.
You know, it's just what we had access to, and then even when we started to have access to more constant eating rice, you know, so we loved it. And like when I'm eating a lot of white rice, I feel really good. I have a lot of energy, and there's so much of that nocebo effect around white rice, and everyone's like, "We'll go towards brown rice because it's more nutrient dense. It's not as, you know, so." But I feel personally, I love white rice, and whenever I'm eating a lot of white rice, like it feels great for me personally. So it's something that I gravitate towards whenever I'm trying to, you know, if I'm looking for an extra source of something, an extra source of energy. I really like using rice for those carbohydrates. So it's yeah, and I think the cultural differences in how we process or in how we prepare food. No, can you comment on that? Like when, let's say somebody who might be a client of yours that is a foreign client, and they're coming into an American university, and they have, you even touched a little bit on it from our discussion last week. Let's say a foreign student comes in, and then, like, you know, let's say somebody from China comes over, and they're an athlete from China, and they're used to eating a lot of rice. They're used to eating a lot of, you know, a lot of certain types of vegetables that are culturally relevant to their area. And then they come over here to the university, and they don't really have access to those vegetables. They're eating, there's more potato type, there's more starchy, like potato type carbohydrates over here. There's more breads, things like that. How do you approach working with those types of clients, and kind of like when they don't have as much access to their foods that they're used to, and they're most comfortable eating?
Yeah, a big argument gets put out that that we as a society are being deceived and fooled, and by increases in chronic illness, hospitals and pharmacies benefit from our sickness, right? There's this rhetoric that goes around in our society that we're consumers of things we don't know. And in some respects, it is true. As far as nutrition goes, I don't think that's particularly the case. When you see the increases in higher body weights, less physical activity, poor nutrition, they coincide with the increases in our culture of dieting and restrictive eating and weight cycling. And to kind of draw that back to your question, is that people say, oh, the food culture here is really bad, right? We have food marketing, bigger portions with cheaper prices. They're just trying to get people to eat certain foods that are calorically dense. And while some of those may hold true, the power that it actually holds on us, right, the impact that it causes isn't as severe or isn't as likely if an individual has positive thoughts and behaviors about their body and food intake. And also, they don't have food insecurity, or they're not under eating. Those advertisements, those things that get us to want to buy more or potentially eat past fullness, those are a result of restricting our bodies. So whenever someone diets, they are more susceptible to advertising, to ordering, you know, getting deals and things off of food, because there's a sense of desperation and starvation that they would actually more likely to choose those things. The research that supports the advertising working on consumers was done. I forget at what university, but that professor ended up getting fired from that university there shortly thereafter. So that data is flawed and inconclusive. But what we do know is that having eating behaviors that are more normal and more regular to fueling your body, you're less susceptible to those type of eating patterns. So back to your question, I would try and normalize, hey, you came to this country, there's not a lot of foods that are as readily available to you. Let's make sure you're getting enough to eat. And that would start by finding things that are familiar, but also intentionally trying to incorporate new and different foods. Because my priority is making sure they get enough to eat. Alternatively to that, probably in the reason they're coming into me would be, there's nothing I like to eat, and I'm potentially maybe gaining body weight. And that's like a typical thing that I see people coming in to see me. But you know, they have to be eating something, and maybe we're going very long periods without eating anything, right? Like a college student, an example. So that's where they become more susceptible to food advertising and marketing.
Gotcha. Okay. So like with that same student, when they come over, and I mean, let's say they have, you know, they're okay with the body image issues, or they don't have any body image issues. They're pretty positive overall. They're just sort of stressed about the fact that they're really not eating what they like. So you would approach that from the perspective of just trying to kind of spit it back at you. So you would approach that from the perspective of like, okay, well, let's try and find other foods that you might enjoy here. That just let's try and expand your horizon a little bit to more foods. Is kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. Where do they live? What kind of cooking appliances do they have? Is there a grocery store within walking distance? Like, just trying to improve their access, but then also improve like the knowledge in which they have to those resources, right? Do we have a on-campus food pantry that they feel that if they don't like the food, they could throw it away, right? Part of having food security and moving towards a place where you can use food in an instrumental sense is being able to experiment with foods, right? I grew up in a way that you clean your plate, you don't take more food than you're going to eat. Like, you have to clean your plate every time because we can't waste food. And some people come for those types of families, and an individual might feel like, if I buy this, I have to eat it all. So that's why I buy foods I only know, which might be one or two things, right? In the case of someone coming from a different country, or even people from poverty. So trying to introduce, like, I can say fruits and vegetables, but I've worked with athletes who've never eaten a fruit or vegetable. Honest to God, like, never.
How?
That's a brilliant question. Thank God for fortification of food. That's what I always think.
Right.
But that's where I got to say, hey, here's something you know, something you love. And I'm going to try to say, like, hey, let's try this. If you don't like it, trash can's right there. Just dump it. But that's a luxury a lot of people don't have. In college sports, at some universities I've worked at, we can always try one new thing. And if a guy doesn't like it, he'll like have the worst reaction, spit it out, make a big deal. And I'm okay with that. But he tried it. And that's more than he's ever done in 18 years of living so far.
Right. So how would you approach that? Because it's a privilege to have such security to food. I mean, because there's a way larger population of the planet that doesn't have food security. So when you approach that, I mean, that gives me anxiety. Like, that's something, like, I come from the exact same type of family. Like, eat it all. You're a growing boy. Eat all that food you can, right. And like, let's try not to waste food, just because it's like I think that for a lot of people, wasting food is disrespectful. Just in general, it's just disrespectful for whatever reason. And I think it's because we recognize that not everybody, I think we subconsciously recognize that not everybody has that access. And I even say that to myself, like, if I'm out at a restaurant and they don't have to-go boxes or anything like that, it's like, okay, well, I'm gonna eat these last few tater tots because, like, there might be a guy on the street who, like, I'm gonna throw that food away. Like, this guy on the street, I might as well, I don't know, pay homage to the fact that I acknowledge my opportunity to be able to eat those extra 3 tater tots or something.
Yeah.
That's so.
You're so right. Being able to kind of discard food is very much a privilege that way less people than more people have, right? So, you know, a lot of my athletes come from that kind of background, and they've just never explored new foods because they don't have the financial backing to do so. Another piece of that too, in coincidence with not wanting to waste food, is when people wait long periods of time to eat. An example is dinner, right? If people know they're not going to eat, they're like, "Ooh, I can't eat past 7." They're gonna load up. Their body's intentionally gonna load up on food because they know they're not gonna have food for a while, right? And that's very intentional. Instead of giving yourself permission to say like, "Hey, I'm gonna eat to a point of fullness and not to uncomfortability," which a lot of people tend to do. And if I get hungry, you know, 10, 30, 11 at night, I'm gonna give my permission to eat whatever I want. So if it's another meal, it's another meal. If it's another snack, it's another snack. But it's being able to say like, okay, that wasn't enough food, or like I ate too much food and my body didn't feel good after that. Kind of going back to our previous thing, like I feel good when I eat these foods. I feel good when I eat this much food, and that changes. So being able to kind of balance that privilege of, okay, I have food security, so I know I can eat it later if I want. I'm gonna have food in the pantry tonight, tomorrow, the next day. And if I throw this food away, I'm going to feel better. And that's being able to balance that privilege is tricky for a lot of people. And I've had to balance that with myself to be able to consciously throw food away and scrape it off. It's foreign. It's very, very foreign. But I'd like to work to that point to help people have access to that, because I think that's a big step for a lot of people.
Yeah. So how would you approach maybe the inverse relationship there with food, where it's like they're not eating enough, like they're not grabbing the large enough portion sizes, and then they, like you said, they're not giving themselves permission to get that meal later at night because they're so used to or they've come to the idea that like maybe they're doing intermittent fasting or something like that, which has all of its own issues, but maybe they're doing intermittent fasting and they just didn't get to eat enough, but then they have this, okay, well, it's past 7 p.m. I can't eat anymore, but I'm still really hungry. Like how do you approach the clients that like they have such, like, how do you start making somebody more flexible instead of having them be so rigid?
Yeah, it's just letting them kind of answer their own questions. It's almost too simple of a way I approach it, but I say, you know, why do you think you're so hungry at night, or why do you think you have like a crazy sweet tooth in the evening, right? And 9 times out of 10, it's from restriction throughout the day. Right? You're not getting enough constantly throughout the day, so we're backloading a lot of it, and that's what a lot of what I see in this country is. We skip breakfast. We're too busy to eat and fuel ourselves during the day. Then we'll bust our butts all the way till 5, and then you get home and your body's been starved all day. So it's a perpetual cycle of restriction and binging. It's finding the balance between consistently eating throughout the day, which poses its own challenges, right? Depending on your lifestyle and occupation and access. But it's trying to find more convenient ways to spread the food around. That's the biggest missing link I see in almost every athlete I've ever worked with, because everyone's busy, right? There's not a single person on this earth who would say, oh, I'm too busy to cook, to have food, to eat. I can't take a 10-minute break to eat a snack.
Right.
So I would start there and say, just add a snack in, see how you feel after, see if you feel lethargic or like, and if it doesn't work, it's just an experiment, right? We're not, and that's the thing about diets that's amazing, is people want to go all in, right? Like, I'm all in on this diet. It's my
You're ready
identity.
to experiment with a diet.
I can't eat that. I'm on this diet.
Yeah.
Or I only eat this because I'm on this diet. Giving someone freedom to eat whenever they want, that's just like counterintuitive. It's like, what are the rules? It's like, just listen to when you want to eat and what you want to eat. And it's very foreign to have that perspective.
So let's follow that one right there. The listening to when you want to eat. Somebody who's grown up with with a strict rigid plan or with a rigid plan or in access to food, or just somebody who in the past 6 years has been focusing so desperately on a rigid meal plan, it's easy to lose those cues. When you and I first started talking, I didn't have any idea really what those cues were. Like, oh, do I feel hungry? I don't know, because I usually eat at 10:30 a.m., and then I eat again at 1 p.m. and then I eat again at, right before the gym. So it's like my body has a routine, so I didn't need to know when I was hungry. But when you start to try and listen, like what do those cues really even sound like, to when you're listening to your body?
Yeah. So this is something that I was working with a client, and we're still working on this. I've known this client for a very long time, and the nature of their schedule is grave shifts intertwined with day shifts. So the cues are all out of whack sometimes, and this client has eaten in a certain pattern for such a long period of their life that the cues are almost non-existent. So the first step for me is identifying what are the 4 cues or forms of hunger, right? Why would someone be hungry or want to eat at all? So the first one that we're kind of alluding to is physical hunger. And that could manifest in your stomach starts to growl, you're feeling a little lethargic, brain fog. Some people get really shaky when they haven't eaten. So tuning into those is a really good step. And some people are not in touch with their physical cues until they become shaky. But some people are like, I'm starting to get a little irritable. Maybe I should get something to eat. And that's something personally, like, I know when I start to get a little frustrated, I should just stop and eat something. And it usually seals the deal for me. What's something that physical cues that you get or you've noticed when you're starting to get hungry?
For me personally, almost instantaneously, for me, it's an emotional cue, but I almost instantaneously get hangry. I notice maybe physical cue, it's more of an expression thing, but like if I look into the mirror and I notice like, oh, or when I'm talking, if I'm less expressive, because I'm usually like, I would like to say that I'm usually not very monotone. And if I look in the mirror, if I'm listening to myself while I'm talking, and if I'm just really monotone and I'm just like short answers, it's like, okay, maybe I'm probably getting kind of hungry. So for me, that's what it is. I don't get shaky. I don't really get like stomach twists or anything like that. And sometimes I confuse hunger with thirst. So those are also confusing too. But I would say maybe for me, it's mostly like I just kind of get irritable.
Okay, yeah. And some cues are different for everybody else, and then some are more sensitive or less sensitive. So it's being able to know what your cues are, right? And some are really abstract for some people, but some are very like, some are very somatic. Like you just feel it and you know. So that's the first one, is physical hunger. The one we almost often always associate with what or how much we want to eat. But there are 3 other ones. So the next one is emotional hunger. What do you think that means to you?
If it's not sort of an expression of like emotional hunger, as in like you're hungry when you get emotional.
What types of emotions might someone get have a desire to eat? And that's physical hunger.
It's different than physical hunger. I mean, I know I'm certainly a stress eater sometimes. So like stress can bring something on, like, oh, okay, like, I'm really thinking super hard about this, and then I go and I grab a snack and I eat while I'm thinking really hard or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. What else emotions?
Depression for sure. There's depression fuels poor eating habits. And for me, I guess depression and stress kind of like are commonly associated. That when I tend to be in like way over my head, I start to get depressed, and then I eat more. So I think those are associated. But maybe depression, anxiety, any sort of downing emotion, I think for me is the most common for wanting to eat. If I'm down at all, I feel like I'm hungry.
Right. Is there any emotions on the other end of the spectrum that you might find a reason to eat or have hunger?
I guess like when you're elated, when you're super happy, celebrations,
Food's a
birthday
huge part of
parties,
that.
people love eating at birthday parties. I guess I never really thought about that. Yeah, I mean, if you're out, you're celebrating a promotion or just, you know, anything that's the success of a friend or something like that, you find an excuse to eat.
For sure.
Huh.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important one.
Yeah, I never thought about the other side of that, because I was, you know, because people tend to give themselves more permission to eat during those types of, at least I do personally, I give myself more permission to eat. It's like, okay, well, I'm celebrating something. And then I feel bad whenever I'm eating because I'm sad.
Right, right. But both emotions, right? That hunger needs to be satisfied by the food, and that's
Right.
part of that that void that you have, right? I'm gonna allude to this later, but hunger is like oxygen, right? It's food is something we need as a physiological necessity. So if I told you to hold your breath for a minute, the first thing you're gonna do when you can breathe again is start to gasp air really fast. If
Right.
you deprive any one of these forms of hunger, you will compensate such, right? It's just a physiological response. And just because we're not physically hungry doesn't mean we have emotional hunger needs too.
So but doesn't, physical hunger is a direct expression, and that's our body telling us that we're hungry. But if we are, is emotional hunger, is that a learned response? I mean, do we learn to eat ice cream when we're sad, you know, from movies or from whatever? Like, do we, like, are those patterns, you said that we need to satisfy that hunger, but for emotional hunger, is that really the case? Do we need to satisfy that emotional hunger?
That's kind of a nuanced question, and I think historically, yeah, food is a form of comfort that we use during stressful times.
Mhm.
Like during the pandemic, people use food as an outlet to cope with their emotions because the resources we have to cope with emotions, and there are lots of them, right? Different forms of self-care and journaling, or you can have professional therapy. There's all these different methods and tools we have to cope with emotions, whether positive or negative. Food is just one of them, and there's nothing wrong with using food as a way to cope with emotions. It actually helps people to work through those emotions better because you have energy to deal with them and do different types of work to alleviate them, right? Like therapy, for example, is very hard work.
Right.
And if you're not fueling yourself for that therapy, the progress you can make isn't as much. So I think food is a useful tool for coping with emotions, but I would also advocate for finding other tools, right? Exercise is a great tool for coping with emotions, for trying to work through them. So while it can be, I'd always advocate for having multiple. Always try and have multiple forms of coping skills.
So just use it as an extra tool, but for what if that is their only tool? I mean, in the case of a lot of folks who emotionally eat when they get depressed, and then they start to gain an abnormal amount of weight that starts to become detrimental to their health, how, like, that is now they're satisfying their emotional hunger to cope with everything, you know? So where do we draw the line between saying, like, it's okay to eat when you're sad and it's okay to eat to satisfy those? But
yeah, I think seeing that as their primary tool, there are things that are potentially more harmful to their health, like drugs and alcohol, that people might resort to. So I'm going to say, hey, here's where we are. We're steps away from finding other tools that benefit you, but it's having them create those for themselves. You know, what the kind of things do you enjoy? What kind of things give you joy and satisfaction in your life? Is it hanging out with friends? Is it art? Is it different forms of expression? I think expressing your emotion is a very reserved thing we don't have in our society as much anymore, right? Some is through movement and exercise or art. Some is through sing and dance. And I think people neglect those things and don't really see them as methods of dealing with our emotions. But anyone who uses food as their primary, that's where we're at, and that's okay. Perfectly normal.
Okay.
But let's try and find some other ones. Let me try and connect you with some other people who know what you're going through or are just as busy as you and don't feel like they have time. Look at them. See how they kind of manage their emotions and lifestyle, and maybe pick their brain. What kind of tools do you use? Because my tools are very different than anyone else. But if you can find someone that they might connect with really well, bless you.
Excuse me. Thank you.
That's where I want to get them to is what else can we do? What else tools can we try out? And like I always say, it's an experiment. If it doesn't work and you've done it a couple times, it's okay. We'll throw it out. We'll try something else. And that really gives them the, okay, I'm not going to get attached to this. I don't need to commit all the way. I'll just dip my toe in the water. And that's usually where we go.
Okay. So we have physical hunger, and we have emotional hunger. What's the third type of hunger that people experience?
The third type of hunger is practical. So this is one for our athletes or our very busy people. And that means, on the go, don't really have time to sit down and have a meal. Maybe I can't digest it in time. Practical is eating in a practical sense, right? So if I know I have to train in an hour from now, I'm not going to eat a full meal, but practically it makes sense for me to eat something because I'm going to train for 2 or 3 hours. And
Right.
2 or 3 hours from now, Davin's going to be really hungry and really mad if he didn't eat something right now. And practically that makes tons of sense. And another example that I like to use, analogy I like to use is if we were going on a road trip and we couldn't stop by any gas stations, what would we do to make sure we have enough gas? We'd load up gas canisters in the back of our car so we could always pour it in. We're bringing more than we need because we know we can't stop along the way. So that's for people who, gosh, I'm not going to be able to, maybe I'm a nurse and I can't eat for these 5 hours because we're really busy. I'm going to eat a little bit more than I need energy-wise to get me through those 5 hours. So a lot of people resonate with practical hunger, and I'm sure you use it in different forms in your daily life. Is there any one that sticks out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I was about to say practical hunger, I feel like, is the type of hunger that a lot of either fad diets or more practical athletic diets sort of kind of lean towards, because it's the understanding that, like, you need this. You do need the food in order to fuel what you're doing. And I think people, it's easier for people to manipulate practical hunger because as logical beings, we can change our behavior around things that are practical. And that's certainly how I've approached it. I mean, that's how I started approaching certain types of food, certain types of meal preps, how much and how often I eat, and then spreading out my food throughout the day just like that. I did it practically, not necessarily because I knew I need to be eating, or not necessarily because it's like, well, I have to be eating 3 hours apart. It's because, like, oh, I'm moving for this whole time. I should probably be eating most throughout the day as well. So I've always approached that from a practical perspective. So yeah, I'm sorry. I hope was at the
yeah. And people use it more or less. I find that our young athletes haven't gotten to that point where they can be strategic to make sure they're getting enough to eat. Always going to be my number one priority, and trying to find in more ways to get nutrients into them. Their hunger cues are off. Usually they have low appetite, people who are on the go. So I'm trying to carve out times for them, even though they might not feel hungry. Hey, we got to eat something. Otherwise your body's going to be screaming.
Yeah.
And that's where I really try to make an investment. So, like, we can't just eat at the end of the day. You don't like to eat breakfast. We won't start there, but we have to at some point eat breakfast.
Right.
And that's where I try to work. I try to pick the lowest hanging fruit from a practical sense. I'm not going to say, you've never meal prepped before, but meal prep would be good. I'm going to say, like, hey, how do frozen meals sound? Do you have a microwave at home? Like, practically, that might be the best thing if you're get home from work tired and, all your fresh fruits and vegetables usually spoil. That's fine. Let's just do frozen meals. That practically makes a lot of sense for your lifestyle, and it gets you enough food. Let's do that. And
yeah, that
using
it's funny that you mentioned that. That's how when I first started kind of just jumping into my fitness journey, 2013, I was working for the Navy, and I was living in Ridgecrest, California, and I was at the point where it was like I had a very rigid, not rigid day, but I had a very, like, structured day where, I had a certain amount of work time, that I didn't really have any family around or anything like that. So it was really just like my whole life was kind of focused around what I did at work and then what I had those few hours left before I went to bed. And I started getting to the point where I thought like, well, practically, like I need to be eating breakfast. So I started buying microwavable breakfast sandwiches, and those were incredible. And I had really never been the type of person to eat a lot of breakfast up until that point. And then I started eating just a microwave sausage biscuit. And every single morning I would eat one of those, and I felt like on the way out the door, like I was grabbing it on the way out the door out of the microwave. It was still piping hot. And so I hardly had enough time. Well, I guess I just didn't make the time for it. I didn't make the time for it, but I made the time to make this 1 minute little sandwich. And that completely revolutionized the way that I started to feel about breakfast, and about just eating breakfast period, but also the preparation time for breakfast. And slowly my preparation time for breakfast has increased over time. And I've started to make more, basically the point of that is now I always eat breakfast as a result of that one little change as a practical change.
Yeah. And you added something so simple, you could do it effortlessly, right? Like brushing your teeth or like taking a shower. Those things just happen, right? You don't think about it like, do I really want it? Like you just do it. It's a habit in a sense, but that's what you're trying to instill to people from a nutrition perspective. At least I try to start very, very small, because you're just trying to cram way too much into such a small space in some people's lives. And that's why I think with parents, especially who have young kids who they try to feed, it is very difficult. There's a lot of pressure on parents to feed their kids certain foods, because there's a lot of fear surrounding giving them this or giving them that or too much sugar or whatever. But, practically feeding your kids, if you have the privilege to put food on the table every night, regardless of what that is, I think that's the bottom line for most parents. And anyone who can do that, I mean, I commend them. And, that's definitely a privilege to have in this day and age. Yeah.
So now we have the three. What's the last type, if you haven't mentioned it already?
So the last form of hunger is taste. So taste is kind of a unique one. And it does come with some privilege, but I think everyone should have access to it in some way, shape, or form. And taste to me, and how it's defined is being able to try novel foods, right? So we have the four. Okay, I'm not physically hungry. I'm not emotionally hungry in any sense. Practically, I'm not hungry. But hey, my grandma just made this amazing banana bread. And I'm in town, or she's in town, or she makes it once a year. I'm going to eat it because it's something that tastes good to me. I'm in Italy. I've never been to Italy. Look at this amazing pasta. I'm full. We just ate, but this pasta looks so good. We have to try it. And it might be a bite. It might be the whole thing. I use dessert as an example, right? Dessert, I just want to taste it. It's just a bite. It's something new. I can try it. That's something that I think everyone needs to get satisfied every once in a while, is to have something that is new, something that's novel and interesting. To keep food interesting to a lot of people, that's a hard task. But if you give yourself permission to taste new things and explore new ideas, food serves you in different ways outside of the other three realms.
It kind of feels like taste as being a form of hunger, because I've never really thought about that, but based on your descriptions of emotional hunger and practical hunger, taste almost seems like sort of a blend and very strongly related to emotional hunger and practical hunger, because it's like, practically, how often do you get to eat, a piece of pie from grandma, and it's like, right. Emotionally you want to, because how often do you get to eat it? So it's kind of a combination of both of those. So with that, of those four types, do you assign, and this might change from person to person, but do you typically assign like a hierarchy of like what you should address first?
Not typically. So what I'll do is have people do food logs if appropriate. And not only are they writing down what their hunger levels are and on the hunger scale, but what emotions they have, what type of environment they're in that might cause them to eat this food or that food or more food or less food. Just situationally looking at what influences our hunger in that moment. So sometimes if someone does this for long enough, you can identify foods that satisfy one or multiple areas of hunger. Okay. So an example would be what something that I eat that satisfies my physical and emotional hunger. What's a food that does that for you?
Let's see. Just like any type of, just like a, I don't know, like a really good meat. A really good meat sort of, like, cause I want to eat something super juicy. And so for me that like, it really satisfies, I mean, it definitely satisfies my physical hunger because it's heavy, you know, and it's like, I feel like I've just eaten something for sure. And then emotionally, like it just, you know, it sounds really good, and I want, you know, I want it all the time. So yeah, I guess maybe something, yeah, like a steak, a good steak.
Taking that example, would steak be practical in a sense before training?
Definitely not.
Right. So let's take that example, but say we're physically hungry and we're practically hungry and we're going to go train. What's a different food that we might use in that case for yourself?
Something that I personally reach for, actually recently I've been reaching for like this dried fruit that I get, because practically, you know, the dried fruit, it releases appropriately throughout. You know, you have sort of like a slow release while you're working out. You get to have that sugar, the energy, you get to have a little bit of fiber. And so for me, that's something I reach for. Maybe even like a Gatorade, you know, it's not something that you would associate with hunger, but like you're getting sugar out of a Gatorade. So practically and physically, you would be, you know, maybe you wouldn't necessarily be satiated, but you know, you would have some calories for exercise.
And it didn't serve our emotional hunger because it necessarily wasn't always there, right? Or for that particular instance. So being able to find foods that cover all bases, that's what I'm aiming for if someone doesn't have access to a large variety, right? What's something that's taste for you? Something that's like, ooh, this is something that I get every once in a while, but it's something that I really enjoy to eat.
Oreos. 1000% Oreos. So good. Yeah. That's my, Oreos, cookies, I guess. Just really cookies. I love cookies. That's a kind of a comfort food for me.
What's interesting about what you said that is in my house and friends I'm living with right now, we got Oreos. Like we ended up buying Oreos every time we go to the store. Like I'll put it in my basket, they'll put it in their basket. So we have 2 Oreos for our household. It's so interesting. We had access to Oreos all the time because there was, you know, you feel bad, I'm going to eat the whole thing. So I kind of reserve a little bit. When we had full access to it all the time, we stopped eating Oreos just because it wasn't novel to us anymore. Right. And it didn't have that kind of mystique about like, ooh, like just one more. And it's funny, I haven't eaten an Oreo, and I love Oreos. I haven't eaten an Oreo in like maybe this calendar year.
Oh, wow. Yeah. It's actually very similar. Like I did the same thing when, because it's my comfort food, I used to use it as like that was what I reached for nightly, you know, as like a quick snack. You know, I'd have like 2 or 3 of them before I go to bed. It's kind of like satisfied like my taste. I really wanted to taste something super sweet. And then so I would have those, and I did that for so long, for months and months, that I guess, it started to lose its novelty, and I haven't been eating them for a while, but I still love Oreos so much. Like when I think about Oreos, I just love them. So it's like, that's funny. One of my friends, Brittany, she has a similar obsession with Oreos, and she always she gets new flavors of Oreos and will like rate them and put them up on her Instagram. She has like an entire story, like a whole storyline of all of the different types of Oreos she's tried with the different ratings and stuff, which I thought was funny. So a lot of people like Oreos.
So true.
Man. So okay, so we have physical hunger, we have emotional hunger, we have practical hunger, and then we have
taste.
Hunger for taste, hunger for a specific type of taste.
Yeah.
And you said that you don't really try to prioritize one over the other. You try to fulfill as many as you can at any given time. What's the most common that you see as being the one that people need to work on more often from a general population?
Yeah, I think one thing that really impairs the other areas is the stigma around eating emotionally. I think it drives further restriction. I think it's of the four, it's the most neglected area. And when you neglect one area of, emotional needs, if we want to use the word need, because they're all hungers a need of our body, it tells us we need something, right? You're hungry for something. That's just your body signaling very loudly. And the longer you ignore it, the quieter that voice gets, and you no longer have that signal. So when you have an emotional response, right, it's being able to address that. And I think our society stigmatizes and shames individuals when emotionally on the negative end of the spectrum, people aren't doing good. And I think we tend to categorize people who may not have good mental health at the time and castrate them for eating certain foods as a coping mechanism. And if we're able to give ourselves permission to have food, we're able to give ourselves permission to all these other resources too, right? We stigmatize mental health services like therapy and psychologists, things like that, asking for help. If we as a society address those stigmas and make it okay and normal to reach for food in a crisis like right now, I think we break down a lot of other stigmas and barriers to our needs, right? If gaining some weight from eating food that alleviates our emotional need at the time is a consequence, I think that's okay. I think that's really okay because it's enabling us to have the capacity to look for other resources in the future or sustain ourselves in the meantime. Everyone's coping with what we have going on very differently, and food's kind of been thrown in the fire for that, right? Like, oh, what do they call it? The COVID-19, like gaining 19 pounds or whatever the case is. Mm-hmm. And I think that really stigmatizes individuals who don't have other emotional coping mechanisms other than food. So not only are they using food as their primary, but they're being shamed for it because of weight gain in some cases. And I think that's really challenging and harmful. So I'm hoping that we can start to normalize using food as a coping skill, but also build on that and say, what else skills can we build and address our emotional needs as a society?
And in what other ways can we use food as a tool? Because if you from those four, you can use it as an emotional tool, a physical tool, and a practical tool all at the same time. So just expanding. I've learned a lot. I didn't realize that food had so many different types of ways that it could really satisfy you, which I guess is probably why it's so important and so hard for people, because it's so much more nuanced than I think we really give food credit for, especially athletes. Personally, I've always I've even gotten a lot of crap for this from foodies. I used to say, I'll eat anything as long as I know that if it's going into my body, it's going to appropriately fuel what I'm trying to do. And the more that I've started to look at that, the more that I've realized it's not. It could definitely lead to a disordered type behavior, and it has for sure. I've always struggled with binging, and probably because when I get something that tastes really good, I overemphasize that taste portion because I'm not going to get this. I vacuum it up, I inhale it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's kind of wild that something as simple and as a necessity can also be used as a tool that is a luxury at the same time.
Yeah. Let me just touch on one more thing, since we touched on the good and bad dichotomy of food labeling.
Yeah.
So an example of a societal bad food is like ice cream or cookies. right? Two of my favorites. Is cookies or ice cream for a majority of people gonna satisfy emotional hunger? Potentially. I think that's a food that as children we use as a source of comfort and security, and it makes us feel good. If we label that as a bad food, and I only eat good foods as a good person, right? And I just want, looking at society's labeling, is kale and celery, are those foods gonna alleviate or meet my need for emotional hunger? For me, no. For some people out there, maybe. But here's, every food has a purpose, right? Every food has a purpose in our needs and our wants. And you can take a food that society looks as bad and see how essential it is to your happiness and your emotional needs as an individual, and not feel guilty for that, because this is what my body needs. I'm listening to it, and it needs ice cream right now, so I'm going to give it ice cream. And I think having that freedom, it's so empowering, for lots of people, whatever your background is, whatever your socioeconomic status is, having that power over your food choices, I think is really important.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Yeah. So I think with that, we could probably end it right there. I think that's a really great place to end that. So to, kind of recap some, we talked about the 4 types of hunger that we can use. We talked a little bit about the morality of food, which I'd love to dive more into in the future, and kind of how we can start approaching that from a personal perspective, especially in a situation like this with COVID. And then we also have these extra added stresses of realizing all of the social injustice that's going on. This is overwhelmingly going to be causing more psychological stress for other people. So I think that this is a very relevant conversation for sure. And I love the idea of being able to use food as a tool in so many different ways. And so hopefully some of the other folks that get to watch this will get to see that as well. So
yeah, one thing I want to talk about next time with you, and I think I just thought of this now, is navigating food conversations. Because I think now that we've laid the land of like, okay, I'm going to make decisions about my health and my needs. What happens when we're imposed on by others and people start to bring up diet talk, or people start to talk about things that you don't align with on a personal basis? How do we navigate those conversations in society? Because they can be difficult, right? When someone says, you're eating that's a bad food, right? Like, how do you respond to the criticism and judgment? I think that's something I'd love to discuss with you and see what we can bring together.
Absolutely. We'll put that on the schedule for next time. So cool, man. Well, thanks again for meeting up. We'll definitely schedule another time to meet again. I'm down to do this every single week if you are for a little while.
Same.
Yeah. Okay. Cool, man. It's the next Thursday work for you again?
Yeah. Let's aim for that.
Okay. Around the same time, 4 o'clock for you? Yeah. Okay. Perfect. All right, Davin. Thanks so much for chatting again, and we'll talk with you soon.
Absolutely. Cool. Have a good one, man.
Hey, you too, man. Have a good weekend.
See ya.